Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
You know, there's a difference between personality and type, but we actually talk about personality types, right? We combine those two words, but type is something a little different than personality, Antonia. And I'd like to, on today's show, talk a little about the differences of these. Why do we conflate personality and type? And what are the distinctions? And how can we be thinking about this in a way that helps us with personal growth, attuning to, I guess, moving forward in the world and how we're wired and using this in the best way possible?
Yeah, and why does it even matter, right? Like, why create a distinction between personality and type and maybe some other related terms like personality traits?
Well, because we're Personality Hacker Podcast, that's what we do. We tend to make distinctions when we do these kinds of recordings.
Well, and I think the distinctions are important because it gives us an opportunity to zoom out a little bit. It's kind of like that old adage that business people will say, stop working in your business and work on your business. When you're so invested in something, the boundaries and borders get real tight. Like if you're into personality types or typology systems, and if you get really into them, you can start to see the frame of the type system as being sort of like that's the sandbox that you're playing in all the time. And that becomes, at a certain point, very limiting if you don't take a meta perspective and zoom out and start looking not in the typology system, but on the typology system. And I think creating distinctions around some of these things are important because it allows us to take that meta perspective and make sure we're not getting too trapped inside of a model. So typology systems create for us an on-ramp and an access point to personality. And so because it creates that on-ramp, it feels sometimes like the complete picture. But I don't think those two things should be conflated. I think we should see personality as distinctive from personality types. I think that's important. And so creating a distinction between those two things and things like traits and other related concepts allows us to make sure that we're not boxing ourselves in like so many people accuse typology enthusiasts of being, is boxed in. Well, sometimes we can do that to ourselves by being boxed into these type systems.
Yeah. On a recent podcast, we talked about maps and territories. We talked about this idea that the map is not the territory, kind of in Alfred Korzybski's definition of this, or his idea around this. And we talked a lot about how people sometimes get a hold of typology, you know, like the Myers-Briggs system, let's say, or Enneagram or any type system, and they start to move through the world almost like fitting people into the system. They walk through. I mean, we were talking to somebody a few months ago who came to one of our live events who this person was almost talking as if they were trying to continually match themselves to a typology system, the Myers-Briggs system. And they were like almost like reverse engineering everything that was showing up for them and trying to give a rationale based on the system. And I remember telling this person, I'm like, there's some stuff that just doesn't track in the Myers-Briggs system. Like there's just behaviors and things you're doing that aren't related to your personality necessarily. So trying to find an answer in personality for all of these things, or for type from all of these things, I think is a little bit of a challenge.
Well, it's a challenge because type isn't the real thing. It's a manufactured version of the real thing. And so if we're trying to take the real thing, which is who we are and our identity and our personality, and we're trying to shove it into the confines of the manufactured thing, then it's going to be, by definition, too confining. It's not going to be accurate because it's just going to lose so much fidelity. And so I think really seeing a distinction between our personality and our personality type is important in the sense that it gives us an ability to create discretion around what can and cannot be patterned. So let's do the thing we keep saying, which is define our terms. So personality is, it's effectively all of us. It's the sum total of who we are. I found a Carl Jung quote, which was, I think, one of my favorite ways that he described personality, because he actually didn't talk about personality all that much. He did some, and he's got an entire volume in his collected works called The Development of Personality, which dives into our childhood and talks about some of these archetypal energies that we attach ourselves to. But as far as, like in psychological types, he talked about the psyche way more than concepts of personality. But this excerpt from Development of Personality I thought was really interesting. He said, the achievement of personality means nothing less than the optimum development of the whole individual human being. It is impossible to foresee the endless variety of conditions that have to be fulfilled. A whole lifetime, and all its biological, social, and spiritual aspects is needed. Personality is the supreme realization of the innate idiosyncrasy of a living being. It is an act of high courage flung in the face of life, the absolute affirmation of all that constitutes the individual, the most successful adaptation to the universal conditions of existence, coupled with the greatest possible freedom for self-determination. So that's quite a mouthful.
That's very poetic.
Yeah.
I like the way he uses words there.
Oh, well, I mean, he is a poet. He was a psychological poet, in my opinion. But effectively, what he's saying is that it is our response to the universe. Our personality is everything that we are. It's the conditions that we were raised in. It's the innate pre-wiring we come with. It is the adaptation to our conditions. It's like the whole enchilada. So when we look at something like personality type and drop the word type and think that type is personality, then there are so many different corners. There are so many different aspects of who we are that are being forgotten or misplaced, or again, trying to shove it into a much smaller frame. So what is personality type? Why am I saying it's a smaller frame? So personality type is basically pattern recognition. It's looking for classifications. It's trying to find ways to see predictable patterns in cognition and in how we show up and in the things that we're going to be interested in and how we're going to make decisions. It's a way to understand how billions of people are kind of sort of playing out similar pre-wired scripts over and over. And while that's very helpful, there is a law of diminishing returns on that, because when we're trying to force our personality to be shoved into the classification of type, then we no longer get to see all of our individual aspects. Like all the parts of us that are not part of predictable models, the parts of us that are not able to be mirrored in patterns of how other people are also wired. It removes our individuation, really. And the purpose of type isn't to remove our individuation. The purpose of it was for us to have an on-ramp to go find it. And that is a word that Jung uses all the time, is individuation.
Yeah, Jung didn't use the word personality as much as he used the word individuation. I think that idea of individuation is something that isn't necessarily popular in the zeitgeist of social ideas, right? It's about collective thought, collaboration, which I think is a great idea. I think we should collaborate and have collective action. And that's hard to grow as a person, your personhood, in a group, right? It's easy. You can have support from the group, but truly the work is inner work. You're changing inner parts of yourself. You're growing and expanding the way your mind is wired, the way your heart shows up, like all the things about you as a person. Often that growth has to happen in an individuated way.
Yeah. Well, and then Jonathan Haidt says we're 90% A, 10% B. So there's a part of us that absolutely wants to merge, mind meld, be a part of a hive, to collaborate and cooperate. And that's a big part of who we are. But there's a much bigger part that recognizes that at the end of days, and we've talked about this in previous podcasts, at the end of days, all those people you collaborated with and cooperated with, they're not going to be there at the end. Like, it's you and you alone. You enter the world by yourself and you leave by yourself. And the act of individuation is the self-discovery that's available to us throughout our lives. Individuation comes from a Latin word which basically means atom. It's a particle that can no longer be divided. And so the act of individuation means that we find our whole selves and discover all the parts that we have synthetically divided ourselves against. So it means not just discovering our traits, our type. So trait is another word that's associated with all of this. And trait would be, our behaviors, basically our behaviors that are predictable. Some people think that traits are things like introversion and extroversion, whereas other people would say that's part of typology. But a trait is basically a set number of patterned behaviors that might come from pre-wiring or might come from, influences in your life, or, the career you chose might dictate a lot of your type traits. So trait is yet another layer on top. But personality goes beyond type and traits. In fact, it has to, because we are not just our predictive set of behavioral patterns. We're more than that. And what type has allowed us to do, you and me, and I think a lot of people, is to start to deep dive into what that might mean. And the reason why a conflation of personality and personality types or type, systems is so dangerous is that the tool that was originally designed to help do that deep dive can sometimes become a hamster wheel itself. And instead of using it as an access point, we use it as like we now shove we stop individuating, we stop looking for whole self, we stop trying to figure out who we are in that lifetime of opportunity, and we start trying to shove ourselves into these patterned behavioral predictive sets of traits, sets of behaviors, and the ways in which another person could find us to be predictable.
Yeah, I was in the gym the other day thinking a lot about this, and I was on one of the machines at the gym. And what's interesting about this, the gym machines are designed to isolate a certain muscle group on this machine. So it's almost like you can't do the exercise wrong. And there's some limitations to this because free weights allow you to, focus on balance of your muscles and other things like that. But on a machine, it's designed specifically to ensure you're exercising the correct muscle group that you're trying to exercise. In a lot of ways, I see type as a similar thing in that machine is useful to exercise that muscle group. But in the real world, you're not necessarily using those muscles in the precise way that machine is training your muscles to use them, right? And so if you go in the real world and you use those muscles, you're going to be using them in all sorts of dynamic, responsive environments. You're not going to be using them the exact way that you did on that machine. But imagine going through the world, trying to engage like your biceps, for example, with machine thinking, and you try to like lift something in the exact way that machine had you exercising your muscles, it would break down really quick. You just couldn't function in the real world. Well, we do something very similar with type. Type is almost this tight framework where we use the word atomized, atoms being atomized information. Type atomizes the information, how we're wired, right? It atomizes the way we make decisions, learn information, and it brings it down to its really small components so we can work with them. Almost like the machine in the gym. It gets us into this, I can grow my copilot auxiliary function, and that's a really great growth path. Well, it's like going to a machine. I can focus on that and I can grow it in the framework of type, but now in the real world, once I get out of the gym of type, I have to be able to use my personality and engage with people I didn't necessarily train for in the same way I did when I was focusing on type. Does this metaphor make sense, by the way?
Actually, I think it's a great metaphor. I love it because the world isn't set up like a gym, right?
Yeah.
It's not set up like a psychological gym.
But type's kind of like a psychological gym for your mind. You can organize and work with your personality by using type to put frameworks around how you're wired, but it's certainly not your whole self or your whole personhood.
Well, and if you use it well, it will strengthen all of it, right? You will be able to, like you mentioned, focus on specific aspects to a point where you build those up and strengthen them, and it will make it easier for you to engage with the real world psychologically. Yeah. If you understand, you go to the gym and you work out with all these machines, and you're going to go, I'm really good at building my biceps, but those calf muscles are not something that I'm great at. So anything that's going to require really strong calf muscles in the world, I'm going to know that will probably be a bit tough for me. And working with type, particularly as we talk about it, right? And as I think the Myers-Briggs world has effectively become a place where most people at least stumble upon Jungian cognitive functions. And Jungian cognitive functions could be considered, sort of these ways of understanding different cognitive muscles that we are pre-wired to be more and less attracted to, or stronger or weaker, or have a bit more of a push-pull relationship with. So I think it's actually a really apt illustration or metaphor. And I would say that taking that one step further, when we use type in that way, we can get to know ourselves in terms of strengths and weaknesses. And we can get to know ourselves in terms of which of my muscle clusters are more apt to work together. When I'm facing certain kinds of, heavy lifting scenarios, so to speak, what's going to come through for me? What are the muscles that are going to jump in and try to take over because they're naturally stronger? And which ones do I have to hone in on a little bit more and be more conscientious and aware and meditate on them a little bit more in order to ensure that they're not being neglected because this other muscle group, it's the hero of the day and it wants to come in and do all my lifting for me. So I think it's a great metaphor.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show.
That said, if we use it the way it was intended originally, and this is, by the way, Carl Jung, he was not a fan of typology systems. He didn't like Myers-Briggs that much. He didn't really like anything that created too fine a line around how the psyche works. And he felt like if you create these really strong sort of boundaries and lines and try to define it too carefully, then you miss the purpose of self-evaluation, introspection, figuring it out on your own, trying to figure out what's going on for you as an individual. And the conversation, and this is something that I think also needs sometimes a come to Jesus moment when it's in the type world and type communities, is that the conversations become so much about the theoretical aspects of type, we forget the importance of a psyche-to-psyche experience. We forget that these conversations could be less about the theory of the system, and it could be more about our personal experiences and how they are striking us as individuals. And so again, it's like, are you working in your business or on your business? Are you working in your personality or on your personality? And when we use types as an on-ramp, it allows us to find places that we otherwise would not be able to locate on our own. So another theory that comes from Jung's work is that our shadow is almost always impossible for us to dive into as individuals without the reflection of another psyche to observe it. It's one of the reasons why entire countries will have their own shadow and be completely unaware of it until another country comes along and points it out for them. And now what we do with that information, whether or not we're willing to receive the information of our shadow, which a lot of times we aren't. I mean, we get our shadow reflected back to us all the time. Every day we're going to have our shadow reflected back to us because that is manifest in our behaviors and our defense strategies and just in the things that we are unconscious around. Like our shadow is basically the sum total of everything we have a lack of consciousness around. And we like to believe that we are our conscious self, right? Our ego, the part of us that we're willing to look at good, bad, right? There's a little bit of ugly in there, but those are the things that we're like sort of like, okay, I can make peace with that. I can be aware of that. Our unconscious self is an aspect that is much more difficult to get to. And I believe that the tool of psychological types was intended to be almost like a stand-in for another person talking to us. As opposed to having to have a psyche-to-psyche experience, the system became a reflection back of things that we would not normally be able to access on our own, things that we would be blind to. And so when we use the system well, when we use psychological types well, we use it as a way to dive into those deeper matters. But we have to be ready for them. The first sort of port of call is the ability to understand that our consciousness can be mapped. It can be mapped, not replicated, not turned into the sum total of a series of letters or definitions of functions, but it can be mapped and there can be waypoints there. And then once we establish faith or trust in the model that it can help us, map our consciousness, now it has the ability to help us map our unconsciousness, which is the shadow aspects. And that's why people like Dr. John Beebe created the 8-function model to say, all right, so now that we have mapped consciousness, now we have given you guide rails or waypoints or effectively language to describe your preferences. And of course, that's a relief. It might feel like that's making the unconscious conscious, but it's actually more giving language to something that you're just aware of, that you're just experiencing. And when you have language, that's a relief. It's a relief to put it into linguistic terms, but it doesn't mean that you weren't consciously aware of it in your day-to-day operation. You just didn't have a way to sort of define it. And when a good typology system helps do that for us, put language to things we're just sort of experiencing as fish in water. And if it does a good enough job, then suddenly it has our trust. And then we can start diving into things like the shadow. And the shadow it's not good news. Otherwise, we wouldn't have put it in the shadow. So the shadow can include all sorts of stuff, just like our consciousness and our personality or our conscious ego. Let's call it ego. That's what Jung calls it. The conscious parts of who we are is ego. Just like our ego cannot be shoved into the box of typology. It can't be put into a model. It's much bigger than that. But it can be guided through the process of understanding it more and more with a system. The same thing holds true for the shadow. And I do also see people sometimes wanting to reduce the shadow down to what we would call our shadow functions, the 4 functions that are attitudinal opposite of the 4 functions we prefer, like in Jungian terms, or especially in the 8-function model that John Beebe has put forth. But they're not really intended to do that either. They're just supposed to be waypoints. They're just supposed to be access points so we can get into the shadow proper. And that has all sorts of stuff in it. It has, memories we don't really want to look at. One could call them repressed. It's got trauma in it. It's got all of our terrible behaviors. It's got our defensive strategies. It has everything we don't really want to look at. Everything that we don't really want to have to acknowledge is a part of us. And yet, without being able to look at the shadow, we can't get to whole self. We can't get to individuation, not divided, because we are divided. We're dividing our ego from our shadow. It's a point of division within us. And so the purpose of typology in its embryonic forms and its point of origin is to give us an ability to see the entire thing enough to be able to have it communicate and talk to each other. And I think that's one of the reasons why things like Beebe's 8-function model is so powerful, because it gives us abilities to access those parts by saying things like, well, the inferior function, that 4th function, is a gateway to the shadow. That's really helpful information. Is it true? Maybe. I think so to some extent. I do think that when you can integrate that 4th function, you can now suddenly see a bunch of other stuff that's unconscious. And at minimum, just know that there is stuff to look at that you're not aware of yet. Right? Yeah. I mean, because that's the first thing. We just have to be aware that we are unaware. And then, of course, Jung goes into this whole concept of the transcendent function, which is effectively a way for the conscious and unconscious to transfer information back and forth. And so, I mean, it gets real deep, but that was the point of it. The point of it was not to create a system that could be obsessed over. It was to create a system that gave you access to the thing that you kind of should be obsessed over, which is your own individuation. So these moments of defining terms and of reevaluating and of working on personality instead of in personality, these are moments that I think that every type enthusiast should have, where they just kind of pause, take a step back, look at the meta perspective on it, and go, am I focused on the right thing? No, I mean, I'm not saying, okay, I don't want to judge anybody. Like if a person's like, I have no interest in using it for growth and development and whole self. I just like the system and I just want to keep flaying out the system. I mean, yeah, you can do that if you want to.
And there's people that work on gym machines. They design and fix gym machines to isolate muscle groups. They probably talk with their colleagues about it. This is their entire life. But working and building a gym machine and calibrating it isn't necessarily building strength, and it's certainly not what most people are focused on when they use those gym machines. They want to see application in their real life. I want to build muscle. I don't care if the machine has ceramic ball bearings versus metal ball bearings. Like, I don't care that much. The person that designed it cares about that. Like, the company that sells it does. But most people using that gym machine just want to build muscle. They don't even care how the machine's put together.
Yeah, and there are some people who spend like 2 hours in the gym every day just isolating each of these muscles as well.
But even those people aren't obsessed with the machine.
Right.
Like, they might use the machine, but they're still focused on the goal or the outcome of the application.
Right. Yeah. And even a person in that situation, though, I would argue that's not real life. That's like a moment of life. And so making sure that you've got some practical application in your life, making sure that there is some way to translate this from these deeper layers into, like living, like going, like hanging out with your partner and raising your kids and picking a career and having a job and talking to your friends.
And this is what I love about the framework of personality outside of type. I mean, obviously we talk about type. This podcast, mostly we deal with the Myers-Briggs system, the type system that is Myers-Briggs, but we also talk about other typology systems. We've talked about human design. We've talked about generational theory. We've talked about Enneagram. Like, we've talked about different aspects of your personality, different type systems inside of personality. The other thing is personality is, it itself is an access point for people. Like, most people have the idea of like, I'm a type A personality or I'm a type B personality. That's a very, very high level, easy to define two groups of people. The type A that's really driven and motivated, the type B that's more lean back and more casual. That's a easy typology system that people can understand inside a personality. Another one's introvert, extrovert. Like, these are things that are in the public consciousness. Like, in all of our psyches, we understand some of these basic building blocks of how people are wired, and personality gives us a frame to talk about that. And if you want to get serious, you talk about health. Health is the general category like personality. Well, you can be healthy going for a walk, or you can be healthy going and do deadlifting and being really precise with your weights. I think personality is the same way. You can be, in a general sense, I can understand, I'm more extroverted. I'm a type A extroverted type person with high openness. Like, that may be all I know in my personality about myself or about other people. And that can be useful, just like going for a walk can be healthy. And if you really want to get in shape, if you really want to dial in your muscles and all of that, you got to focus on nutrition. You got to focus on different muscle clusters. You got to take it serious, and you start to create frameworks around. You use those machines I'm talking about. You do the free lifting or the weights to calibrate, and you start to build the muscle and get into shape you want to get into by putting focused attention on it. And I think type does that. It's like, okay, I know a general sense of personality. Now I'm really ready to grow. I'm really ready to apply this in my life. And I think what you're talking about, Antonia, the shadow, ego, all that stuff that's even further down the road. Most people are just ready to take the one click from, I have a general personality, I'm a type A kind of extrovert person. Wait, there's more about how I'm wired. I'm a thinker also, and I like my organization in my outer world because I like to wander the halls of my mind. Wow, this is interesting. So how can I use that to increase my happiness in my life and my relationships and my career and all these things? So I think what personality does is it casts a wide net, and it gives people this ability to come in a casual way or a more formal way. And I think this is something that almost everybody, when you say the word personality, understands what you mean. But when you say type, they don't necessarily, they have to be educated on what type means.
Right. Yeah. And I totally agree. I think that that's one of the beauties of all of this work is it's actually accessible to every human being on the planet. It's just at what level of depth do they need to land at in order for it to be useful to them? And I think that that's totally valid. I think people go through individuation in multiple different ways, just like people get healthy in a lot of different ways. You don't have to use a single tool. Like you said, if a person is trying to get healthy, maybe they just need to go for a walk every day. And you can expand walks. I mean, our very good friend Dan, who we have interviewed multiple times on the podcast, has turned walking into hiking and hiking into basically almost like a profession. He's done the Triple Crown. Whenever we've picked him up from one of his major hikes, he's very healthy and he's lost a lot of weight and he's gained a lot of muscle and, and it's something that keeps him young and vibrant and alive. That's very different than going and hitting the gym every day. And yet, both, I would argue, are ways to get healthy. Now, there are also people who are gym rats whose goal is not to get healthy. It's to look a certain way. And sometimes they'll do things that are unhealthy for them in order to get that result. So, I mean, and again, no shade. Like, if you want to look a certain way and that's your number one goal, you get to use your body and your life however you want to. And I think it is good for those of us who are into typology systems to maybe take a moment and ask ourselves why we're in it in the first place. Is it because we want to become the best version of ourselves and gain wholeness and individuation? Is it because we want to sound smart and be able to game other people and understand people quickly and be able to turn, situations to our benefit? What ultimately is the thing that we are trying to accomplish with these deep dives?
Yeah. And I also like the frame of personality too, because it allows me to meet people on whatever type system they bring to me. So we have a common maybe shared language where we say, hey, let's talk about your personality. And they bring me some 4-part system. Maybe it's like 4 different colors. And they say, well, I learned this type system where it divides people into 4 basic color groups, red types of people and blue types of people. And here's the characteristics. I don't necessarily have to move that person into the Myers-Briggs system, let's say, to be able to coach them or work with them. Because I have the framework of personality, and personality is the entire person, every aspect of who they are. And it's the framework of personality in that we can become a better version of ourselves through personality. Like our personalities can be upgraded over time. They bring a type system like that into me, and I go, I'm just going to use the language they already know. I'm going to coach them using that language. I'll in my head reverse engineer. Like I might take those 4 colors and I might map them to the firm model that we've developed here, Personality Hacker, for example, to sort the 16 types down if I'm using Myers-Briggs. And I might just, like red might represent the freedom fixation in the firm model. And so I'll say this probably is an EP type I'm talking to, or those are EP type people. And then I'll just start to coach, knowing what I know about the system I'm familiar with in the framework of personality using the language they're already used to. And this has been a huge benefit for you and me, Antonia, in our coaching, because a lot of people come to us having preconceived ideas on whatever system they want to use. Like they already come with a system they kind of already familiar with and want to use. We'll just use that language on their behalf. And that starts to really open up as like a coach, as a teacher, as a person in business. If you can have the framework of personality and meet people with the system they're bringing to you, you are very powerful and able to help people.
Yeah, I would agree. It's almost like learning a computer language. Like, if you learn coding in one language, you can kind of transfer it to other coding languages too, or at least you understand the principles of them. And so I do think that that's a huge benefit to learning typology systems and saying personality and having people come with their own. I have noticed that there are certain personality systems that are more beneficial for how they're categorizing, like in certain styles than others. Like take, for example, when you're talking about type A and type B. Have you ever heard somebody say, I'm a type B? It's like,
yeah, actually, well, they never said I'm a type B, but they'll say that's a type A person.
Oh, yeah.
Like they're so type A, they cause everybody distress in the office. They're driving things. And I've never heard somebody necessarily self-reflect that they're type B, but they have definitely projected type A, assuming that they're coming from the position of type B.
Yeah. Well, or the person's so type A, and I'm a little type A. I think that the type A, type B was more helpful to distinguish the type A people.
Yeah.
And introversion, extroversion, it's like very few people claim extroversion. I mean, they do, but most people are like, I'm an introvert, and that was the game changer for them. I've noticed in Myers-Briggs, it's usually intuitive. I'm an intuitive. Like that was the big game, reframe.
And to circle all of this back to the beginning, if you notice, it doesn't matter what specific type system that we're talking about inside of personality. Every one of them is focused on individuation, right? So it's like like you just said, type A, type B. It was about making sure that we individuate the type A people away from the rest of us so we know where the outliers are.
Yeah. I don't know. Are type A's the outliers?
Well, I mean, like... It's used to individuate. It's almost like to say the other.
Yeah.
And it's really hard. That's the one thing in personality. We talk about whole self, but in order to have whole self, we have to individuate away from everybody else. And I would argue it probably works the other direction. The more you're associating with groups of people or the collective, the more you have to individuate yourself on the inside. You have to separate parts of yourself away from each other.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. And the other thing that came up for me as you were talking about that is, as we're individuating from other people, we have to, by the same token, I think that idea that we're all sort of patterns and pre-wired to be similar to each other, it allows us to be more sensitive to this concept of othering, which, while, othering in the outside world socially, when we other somebody else, there's a reason why we do it, in part to individuate. When we other groups of people, like whole collectives of people, well, weirdly enough, it might not be that those people are the problem. It might be that they are reflecting back to us something that we want to other in ourself. And so a part of, another benefit to understanding these systems, but I would just say as, trying to be people who are in touch with who we are, self-aware, have heightened self-consciousness, and individuate, understand ourselves, is this idea of othering other people is usually a symbol of othering within the self. And now we are a house divided again, right? Now we're back to having that division. So weirdly enough, true individuation away from the collective means that we're trying to not be a house divided. We're trying to find all these parts of who we are. And when we can come to whole self and merge those aspects and stop trying to project the things we don't want to see outside of ourselves, and we come to a place where we're no longer a house divided, we're an individual, right? Not divided. We are that particle that cannot be divided anymore. Then when we enter the outside world, we are far less likely to other people, right? Because they're no longer reflecting back things that we don't want to see about ourselves. So even if we are a person who values being part of a collective or cooperative or highly social, like we think that the important thing is to like be part of movements or be part of a bigger group and not just individuate. The truth is that true individuation actually makes us a better part of a collective. It actually makes it so that we're far less likely to push people away when they're reflecting back things that we don't want to see, because we're now open to seeing those things. We're no longer afraid of the reflection other people will have back to our shadow, because that is one of the services other human beings provide for us, is that they are a mirror back for the things that we don't want to see about ourselves. And so the individuation process works whether or not you're a completely self-consumed person and it's just all about you, or whether or not you're a person who wants to be part of a collective. Both a person who has an individual perspective, what is that called? I'm a very independent person, right? Collective versus
individual, I guess.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what, like the people who just like are like, no, I'm never going to be a part of a group, regardless whether you want to be the lone wolves among us. It works for both sides, I think. And I mean, again, you're the only person you travel through every second of your life with. And so making friends with that person, understanding them, making peace, accepting them, not acceptance in the sense that you don't want to improve, but accepting the reality of the self. When we accept, we now have a better idea of our starting point. And so we can actually make more gains as we do as we flex our psychic muscles, as we build those. And I think typology systems give us a wonderful opportunity to do that, as long as we keep them in their place, as long as we understand that that's what they're there to facilitate. Now, again, like you said, there are some people who design equipment, and there are some people who obsess over, gym equipment, and there are some people who go into the gym a couple hours a day and only focus on isolated muscles. There's a place for all of that, right? And if we don't have those people who obsess over the gym and gym equipment and that sort of thing, then the rest of us who are just hitting the gym 3 times a week and just trying to keep ourselves in a relatively fit space, then we don't get the benefit of all of that. So there is a place for obsessing over it. And at the end of the day, if it's not your career, if it's just your hobby, then there's going to have to be ultimately a place for application, or there should be. And if you allow yourself a place for application, then you can bring all of these amazing things into your everyday life, which is kind of the point. And I would argue that individuation, understanding the whole self, getting into that place of ego and shadow and conscious and unconscious communication, passing information back and forth and understanding things like concepts like the persona, which we've talked about before. All of those things allow us to find whole self. And then at the end of days, we did our job, right? We die with the most information about the one person we traveled this life with. And I don't think anybody who spends their life individuating, I don't think anybody who spends their life understanding the self, I don't think they regret that, because the things we have to do in order to understand the self give us adventures. They give us exciting lives. They give us opportunities and overcoming obstacles and getting out of our comfort zone and making peace with terrible things. Like, I don't know anybody who spent their life individuating that at the end they were like, gosh, I wish I had just been more ignorant. I wish I hadn't spent all that time understanding myself in all of these adventures. So I think it's a noble pursuit.
Well, and it's also the human capacity. Like, what are we capable of? If we actually put our mind and attention to things, if I don't spend my day on my phone and distracted with all sorts of stuff and completely caught up in the BS drama of life, and I attune myself to output and learning and growth and joy and happiness and all the things that enrich my life, what is possible? Like, what could I create with the life I've been given? So I think that's the other thing that comes from this too. So what do you think? You've been listening along. You haven't had a microphone. You've just heard me and Antonia have this conversation, but you've been the third person here. We want to hear from you. What's coming up for you between personality and typology? Are you a person that is latched onto a specific type system? You're like, man, you can pry the Enneagram out of my cold, dead hands, Joel. It's the only system that makes sense to me. Screw personality. I just love this system and I want to just talk about the system all the time. Or maybe you're on the other extreme. You're like, I'm agnostic to systems. I'm about personality. It doesn't matter. Whatever system comes in, whatever system you propose, I'll use it. It's no big deal. Or maybe you're somewhere in between. I'd love to hear from you. We would love to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, you can leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your personal story about what's coming up for you.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. We have some great programs at Personality Hacker that are designed to help you individuate, get to whole self, get beyond just looking at type as a theory, but see it as practical application and a way to diagnose elements of your life. We have a relationship program called Couples Mapping, which allows you to take a side-by-side comparison of each other's personality types and look for the good, bad, and the ugly and be able to transcend some of the biggest differences. We also have programs that are body-mind practices. We have programs that are designed for your specific personality type. We have programs designed around career. So go check it out. It's personalityhacker.com. Look under the suite of programs and see which one is right for you.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.